One of the popular debates in terms of web services right now is REST versus SOAP. When should you use REST versus SOAP or vice versa? And can REST completely replace SOAP? So let's take a look at some of the arguments and background there. SOAP stands for Simple Object Access Protocol and represents an evolution over XML over RPC, where you would use things like Corba or DCOM or another ORB to share data or objects across network boundaries. And the approach to SOAP is to expose operations that implement logic. So there would be a submit order operation, and you would have a XSD object schema definition for what an order looked like. And SOAP does provide loose coupling for integrating diverse systems, and that's really what it was designed for. It's designed for distributed computing, and it's designed to be extensible. And you will find many WS Star standards that extend the SOAP specification. SOAP also offers standard error messaging, using SOAP faults with standard code and subcode for error types. And SOAP aligns very nicely with enterprise application needs and goals. It supports transports other than HTTP, which includes SMTP and JMS, to name a few. And it supports enterprise security with WS Security. It's also language neutral, platform neutral, and transport neutral. And it is ACID compliant and supports atomic transactions with WSAT, supports reliable messaging with WSRM, and provides easy governance through strong typing. In addition, because of its maturity in the marketplace, there is a broad set of development tools that you can use to build both client-side and server-side artifacts for SOAP services. Next, let's take a look at REST and SOAP side by side. As we said before, REST is focused on exposing resources which represent data, whereas SOAP is focused on exposing operations which represent logic. In addition, REST is mainly point-to-point, whereas SOAP is designed to be loosely coupled for distributed messaging. So in addition to point-to-point, which is supported in SOAP, there's asynchronous messaging and pub submodel that you can use with SOAP. SOAP also supports stateless and stateful conversational operations, whereas REST is focused mainly on stateless communication. In addition, one of the big differences with SOAP is there's very strong typing. And in your WSDL definition for SOAP, you'll find not only schema definitions for your operation input and output, your request and response, but also schemas for your data objects. Whereas when you look at REST, a WADL file provides the URIs, operations, resources, and formats that are generated by the services. So those are some of the main differences. So there's two sides to the argument. One is that REST is better, and obviously the second is that SOAP is better. Here's some of the arguments why REST is better. REST can be consumed by any client, even a web browser, with AJAX and JavaScript. It's lightweight and doesn't require any XML parsing, and doesn't require a SOAP envelope for every message that goes to and from a service provider. And this is very true. Since you don't have to parse XML, the requirements on the client side are much lighter than if you did have to work with XML. And since you don't have to provide a SOAP envelope for all of your requests and responses, then the amount of data that goes back and forth between a consumer and a producer is not as big as with SOAP. One of the other arguments is that SOAP is old and all the cool kids are using REST. If you look at the current consumer-facing web sites like Twitter, Google, Flickr, Facebook, and so on, many of these are using REST services. And it's very easy to learn how to use REST. It's just nouns and verbs and resources. So I can get a customer object, I can delete a customer object, and so on. It goes very well with the canonical data model of resources and verbs and actions. Plus, there's an argument that REST is pretty safe, that you can filter out requests that are not GET operations and then look more closely at those while allowing GET operations to flow through a firewall more easily without too much inspection. So that's an interesting argument, as long as you stick with a RESTful model and that your GET operation only does a read and does no write whatsoever. So these are some of the arguments, and now let's take a look at why some people would say SOAP is better than REST. So one of the challenges with working with RESTful services is that it's difficult to build a client for REST sometimes. Whereas if you have a WSDL, you can easily generate client-side artifacts like a client proxy. With REST, if you're going from scratch, then you might have to write raw HTTP calls. And in addition, you have to utilize the HTTP error codes to see success or failure. Whereas with SOAP, you can use the SOAP fault, and you can also use your custom exception types and codes in order to do error handling. Plus, many IDEs currently support SOAP development, and many of them have rich features around supporting SOAP development, both for the client code and for the server-side APIs. One of the other arguments is that REST only supports HTTP or HTTPS. One of the problems with HTTP is that it is synchronous, and every good enterprise architect knows that you need asynchronous processing or asynchronous messaging in order to support scalability long term. If you have to service all of your requests in a synchronous fashion, that means in order to service additional requests or to provide your service to additional consumers, you have to provide more threads within your application server or within your enterprise service producers in order to support those requests. Whereas if you use asynchronous messaging, you can support additional consumers by using the same number of producer threads. So the approach to asynchronous messaging is to decouple the thread that is servicing the consumer from the thread that is providing the service or executing the business logic. In addition, REST, in terms of enterprise level security, REST is not as secure as SOAP, especially if you include parameters as part of the URI. So these are the query parameters, not the path parameters. In addition, there's no support for acquiring tokens for a client-server model, right? Again, we're just putting and deleting resources. Another argument is that REST is not reliable. You have to handle failures with retries, and there's no support for reliable messaging like you'll find in WSRM. In addition, since REST is not strongly typed, it's harder to govern. And you can easily see a proliferation of RESTful services because they are so easy to create and expose your data. There's additional products that offer features for SOAP, such as the service registry, where you can know who is consuming your services and do dynamic lookup of services as well. Whereas the support for RESTful services is not as strong as we currently see for SOAP. So both SOAP and REST have their rightful place within enterprise and consumer applications, and there's no reason they can't coexist and support the same applications. REST is ideally suited for exposing data over the internet or networks in general, and has low bandwidth and CPU requirements. It's also good for creating mashups of different content from various providers on a web page. However, if you look at the enterprise requirements for messaging, you may find that SOAP is a better fit because it offers enterprise features like high reliability with WSRM, transactions with WSAT, security with WS Security, and asynchronous processing of messages. It also supports contract first development, such that if the contract changes, then both the producer and consumer need to be updated in order to handle the change, which in some cases can be bad, but in many cases can be good, especially at an enterprise level when you don't want your interfaces to change without the right level of governance. In addition, SOAP supports stateful conversational operations, such that you can have a conversation with a server and have that span multiple calls and have the same context for those calls. It also has lots of standard support and interoperability with business applications like Siebel and SAP and PeopleSoft, which are important to many enterprises today. It also has great tooling support for both client-side and server-side APIs. So while the learning curve may be shorter for REST, the tool support and ongoing support for SOAP services is very mature.